all empires fall. You look at history, Mongolian Empire, Roman Empire, whatever empire, Dutch Empire, Spanish Empire, all these empires eventually reach their end. German Empire, all these empires eventually reach their end and they die. And so I don't think America has an exemption from this reality of history. We keep saying, oh, but we're between two giant oceans and we're so far away. That doesn't really matter because America still stretches itself out very thinly. And when empires stretch themselves out too thinly, they kind of fragment. They kind of go through erosion. We saw this with the Roman Empire. Rome went all the way up to England, what is now called England. And Rome really stretched itself out very thinly. And it was logistically very draining, logistically very difficult for the Romans to have to send soldiers all the way up to England, especially in those days when they didn't have the technology that we have today. And so to constantly be sending soldiers into England proved to be really impossible to do for a seriously long time. And so eventually what happened was the Romans just abandoned England. They abandoned that whole area. And after they abandoned it, it was taken over. Eventually, it was taken over by the Anglo-Saxons. And the Christian people who were living in England, abandoned by the Romans, were left to the incursions of this Germanic horde. And they were eventually vanquished, conquered, and almost exterminated. So empires will always break. And when empires stretch themselves out too thinly, it usually spells the beginning of the end. And the American empire, I believe, is just, it's too big for itself. And our arrogance has outgrown our capacity to maintain our empire. And if America drags itself down into a forever war in Iran, it'll spell the end of the American empire. And the reason why I say that is because, well, if you look at the Roman Empire, what was one of the things that spelled the end for the Roman Empire? It was Rome's forever war with the Parthians. And the Parthians were an Iranian people, like the people in Iran today, although I believe they were mixed with Scythian. And the Romans never could defeat the Parthians. And that war lasted a long time. It lasted a long time. And when the Romans, after the Romans destroyed the temple, the Romans were fighting the Parthians, and the Jews who were living in the Roman Empire, the Jews who wanted to revolt from Roman power, they said, hey, look, the Romans are spending all this time fighting the Parthians, and they've sent so many soldiers to fight the Parthians that there aren't really a whole lot of soldiers in our territories here. There's not a whole lot of soldiers in Judea. There's not a whole lot of soldiers in Egypt. There's not a whole lot of soldiers in North Africa. There's not a whole lot of soldiers in Cyprus. And so what the Jews did, what the Jewish revolutionaries did, was they coordinated a massive revolution called the Kitos War. No one really talks about the Kitos War. Everyone wants to talk about the destruction of the temple and all this stuff, but nobody wants to talk about the Kitos War. And the Kitos War was really... it was really a continuation of the very war that was commenced by the Levitical priests 40 years after the crucifixion of Christ. And this war, the Kitos War, was much more brutal, I believe, than the war that led up to the destruction of the temple. Because there were so many civilians who were butchered, non-Jewish civilians. Because, you see, the Jews in those days, they had this ideology. They had this prophecy in their holy text. If you read, and you can read it yourself, it's in the Hebrew War Scroll, the Jewish War Scroll, which was discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Once they discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, when they looked through the Dead Sea Scrolls, they found the War Scroll. And when you look at the War Scroll was all about butchering all of the non-Jews. It literally talks about this. It says, we are going to destroy all non-Jews. It says this in the War Scroll. And it talks about this prophecy in which the Jews will have their Levitical priests, and the Levitical priests will be in the war, and they'll blow some trumpets or something like that, and the Jews will first go against the non-Jewish Semitic peoples. And it talks about this war between the Jews and the neighbors of the Jews, the Arabs and other non-Jewish Semitic peoples. And it says that eventually the Jews will wipe those people out. And then the Jews will go after the Hamitic peoples. We're talking about the African peoples. And it says something like, for 10 years, the Jews will have this war against the Hamites. And eventually the Jews will wipe out the Hamites. So all of the Africans will be wiped out, according to the War Scroll. And then, once the Arabs and the blacks are wiped out, the Jews will go to war against the Japhetic peoples, the European peoples. And the European peoples are supposed to be the final boss of the Jewish fighters, the final boss for Israel. And it says that after so many years of fighting against the Japhethites, the Europeans, the Japhethites, the entire Japhetic race will be wiped out. The Jews will wipe them out. And the Jews will be supreme in the world. I mean, this is what the War Scroll teaches. And this is what was being taught. This is what was being taught at the time of Christ. So you can understand how when Jesus was saying, hey, you guys are being exploitative towards the Gentiles, you get an idea of how thick the racism and tribalism was when you read the War Scroll. And when you read in the scriptures how Jesus is saying, hey, you guys are abusing the Gentiles by selling merchandise in the court of the Gentiles where the non-Jews are allowed to pray. My Father's house was built to be a house of prayer for all nations. You guys aren't honoring this. When you read the War Scroll, it really sheds light on what Jesus was fighting against. It was serious racism and tribalism to the point where the Jews thought that they were going to wipe out all the non-Jews. That's how bad it was. It was nasty. So the temple was destroyed about 40 years after the crucifixion. And then sometime after that, there was what's called the Kitos War, which began at 115 AD. I read that in front of me, to be honest with you guys. I don't remember all these dates, but yes, it began at 115 AD, and it lasted for 2 years, so it ended at 117 AD. But because the Romans were so bogged down in their war against the Iranians, the Parthians, the Judean rebels, the Jewish rebels, did a coordinated revolution in various parts of the Roman Empire. North Africa, and Cyprus, and Judea. And while these revolutionaries were doing their uprising in Egypt, the revolutionaries in Egypt thought, let's go slaughter the Egyptians, because there's not a whole lot of Romans to defend the civilian population. And the Judean revolutionaries butchered thousands upon thousands of non-Jews in Egypt. And they went in North Africa alone, because it wasn't just Egypt, it was also in other parts of North Africa. In North Africa alone, they slaughtered over 200,000 people. This is what we read in the Roman historical record. 200,000 people alone butchered in North Africa by the Jewish revolutionaries. And the Jewish revolutionaries did a revolution in Cyprus. And in Cyprus, they butchered hundreds of thousands of non-Jews. Hundreds of thousands. Because they believed that it was their time to butcher the non-Jews. And they thought that they had a right to do that because God was on their side. And they were going to slaughter the heathen. And they were going to basically dominate. So they wanted to fulfill the War Scroll. And the Romans eventually defeated them. And the Jews were kicked out of Cyprus. So people will tell you, oh, the Jews were kicked out of Cyprus, but they will never tell you why they were kicked out of Cyprus. That's the reason why they were kicked out of Cyprus. Because they butchered hundreds of thousands of people in that island. And the Cypriots established a rule saying that no Jew will ever be allowed to enter this island again. Now, I'm not saying that that's right, but I'm just telling you the context in which that rule was decreed. Going back to Parthia, the Romans ended up in this forever war against the Parthians. And you can fast forward to the emperorship of Julian the Apostate, and you will see that the Romans were fighting the Parthians when the Romans were under Julian the Apostate. And Julian the Apostate actually partook in a battle himself against the Parthians. And a Parthian spear pierced him, and he ended up dying. So Rome's forever war in Parthia was one of the signs that the Roman Empire was eventually going to just die. Because you can only exhaust an empire so much. You can only exhaust the subjects of an empire to the point where the subjects are just going to get sick of war. And the empire just exhausts itself to death. And I think that if America continues on the road that it's continuing on, if America continues to tread upon the path that it is treading upon, America will exhaust itself into not really being an empire anymore. And the people of America already are exhausted with war. They're not interested in war at all. You can't really tell me that it is a popular position to say that we should have war in the Middle East. It's obviously the most unpopular thing that a politician can say. Why? Because people just don't want war. Why? Because people don't want to die. That's the reason why. People don't want to die. People don't want to die in a nuclear holocaust. People don't want to die on a battlefield. People don't want to have loved ones die in a battlefield, in a war that's bullshit, that a war that didn't have to happen. And that's the bottom line. And people are saying, listen, no more wars for Israel. And, you know, it's interesting. I was thinking about this a while back ago. I read a book that talked about Israel's undue influence on America's foreign policy. It was called The Israel Lobby by John Mearsheimer. I read that book back in 2018, and I did a whole bunch of videos on it. And I still have those videos in my external hard drive. If you guys want me to re-upload those videos, let me know. I will be happy to do so. But I did a whole bunch of videos on John Mearsheimer's book. It was called The Israel Lobby. And I pissed off a lot of people doing those videos, which was my intention overall. It was to piss off the Zionists who were following us, because we had a lot of Zionists who were following us at that time. And I wanted to let those people know that I wasn't really buying what they had to say anymore. And I'm a free-spirited person for the most part. And if someone tries to control me, if someone tries to tell me what to do and say, you can't say that, I have this urge to just do the opposite. It's just human nature. I think God designed us to be individualistic to a great extent. We are tribalistic, we're collectivists also to a great extent, but we're also individualistic. And I was told by people who were donating money to our site, hey, don't criticize Israel, because, or else, you know, this is why we're giving you money. We're giving you money to praise Israel. And I kid you not, this actually happened. There was a Zionist guy who called us up, and I won't give his name, but he called us up and he said, you guys got the money to support Israel, to love Israel. That's why we're doing this, to love Israel. And in my mind, I was like, fuck you. That's my response. And my response was the exact response that Elon Musk gave to the ADL. Go for yourself. And I remember when Elon Musk said that, the whole crowd went silent, and Elon Musk said, go fuck yourself. Am I clear enough? So to piss those people off even more, I decided to do videos exposing the Zionist lobby, the pro-Israel lobby. And I found this book called it was called the Israel Lobby by John Mearsheimer. Guys, if you have not read this book, damn it, go on Amazon right now and go buy yourself a used copy of it. At least, I mean, if you don't want to spend money for a new copy, go buy a used copy for a lesser price and just read that damn book. It's very educational, very informative read. And John Mearsheimer talks about how AIPAC has all this influence on our politicians, and how all of our politicians, and now this is not the case anymore, but at that time, I want to say all of our politicians were getting AIPAC money, and how all politicians who were getting AIPAC money had basically an AIPAC operative making sure that that politician said what Israel wanted them to say. And this AIPAC operative would make sure that his politician, the politician that he was in charge of watching, would not say anything that would be contrary to the Israeli narrative. So I read that book, and I'll be honest with you guys, every time I found something interesting in that book, I would do a video on it. Like, I would find one line in that book that I found fascinating. I'd say, okay, let's do a video, turn the camera on. And in those days, guys, I had zero editing. I would just film the video and upload it with quirks and all, didn't give a damn. And that pissed off a lot of people. And there were people calling me an anti-Semite. Anti-Semite for what? My family comes from the Middle East. I'm of the line of Shem. There's no anti-Semitism in me. So the thing is, I remember thinking to myself, you know, a lot of people are reading this book, and a lot of people are also agreeing with me in the comments section. So I began to notice, and this was back in 2018 when Trump pulled out of the Iran deal. And I remember doing articles at that time saying, bad idea to pull out of the Iran deal. And people are now figuring this out, that it was indeed a bad freaking idea. But back in those days, Zionism was still very popular. It was growing in unpopularity, but it was still popular nonetheless. And there were people who were saying, oh, I don't trust what the IAEA has to say. I don't trust the UN. It's an anti-Semitic organization. And I didn't give a damn. I was saying IAEA is saying that this is a bad idea and we should trust the information. But people didn't want to listen because people always hate knowledge when the knowledge goes contrary to their narrative, to their bias, when the knowledge and the information goes contrary to their favorite political football team. And for the longest time in American history, the favorite political football team for a lot of Americans was Israel. Now, that's not so much the case. There's been a shift. But at that time, as I was doing these videos, giving commentary on what Mearsheimer had to say, I noticed that there were a lot of people agreeing with me. And I noticed that a lot of people were reading this book, and the book caused a big stir. So I started thinking to myself, you know, popularity for Israel is dying out. And it's eventually going to come to an end. And I did a bunch of videos on this. I mean, me telling you guys that popularity for Israel is dying is really nothing new. I've been doing this for a long ass time. It's just that the channel that I did all those videos on is no more. YouTube got rid of it because, you know, I was anti-Semitic, which I wasn't, but YouTube accused me of being anti-Semitic, so they pulled the whole channel down. But I've been on this trend. I've been observing this trend of anti-Israel sentiment for a long time. And I remember having this conversation with my dad one evening in 2018 because I had been reading Mearsheimer's book. I was doing all these videos. I was pissing these Zionists off. And I remember, I will never forget this night. It was on an evening. I forget which day, but it was in the evening time. And I was sitting at this couch in my living room with my dad, and we were talking. And I told my dad, I said, Dad, one day the whole world will go against Israel. The whole world. Not just African countries, not just Middle Eastern countries, because those countries are already critical of Israel. I'm talking about the Western world. You will see the Western world, America, you will see Americans, Westerners, wake up to the Israel lobby, and they're going to hate Israel. The whole world, I said, will hate Israel. The whole world. And part of that was because one of the reasons why I came to that conclusion was because I noticed the popularity for what Mearsheimer was saying. But secondly, it was just an intuition. It was my gut feeling. My gut was telling me the tide is turning. The shift against Israel is happening. And now you see it. And you go on to X. Who do you see supporting Ted Cruz? Not very many people. Who do you see supporting Mr. Tucker Carlson? Almost everyone. Why? Because we are seeing, we are witnessing, we are beholding the death of Zionism. Bottom line, it's happening right before our eyes. And Iran bombing Israel is really a presaging sign of this. And it's a sign, at the end of the day, of this reality. And the fact that not a whole lot of people really sympathize with Israel really is a sign of this phenomenon that is rising every single year. I mean, the Palestinians did a massacre of the Jews on October the 7th of 2023, and you had 1 million people in England doing a march, not for Israel, but against Israel. You had, I want to say, 1 million people in Greece doing a march, not for Israel, but against Israel, in support of the Palestinians. So you would think after this Charlie Manson-style massacre of the Jews that people would rise up and say, holy shit, man, this is terrible. No. A lot of people not only were indifferent, but they were actually praising what Hamas did, which is disturbing. I don't like it. I don't like what happened on October the 7th. It was obviously a massacre. It was an atrocity. It was a crime. It was murder. But my point is that the fact that so many people have zero sympathy is a sign that Zionism is dying. That's what people need to understand. And Israel understands this. Why do you think Israel was so adamant about Trump abolishing TikTok? Remember that? Remember they were saying, well, we have to ban TikTok because TikTok is owned by China. It's communist and they're going to get all of our information. They're going to spy on our young people. We can't have that. They're going to spy on America's youth. Our youth. This is the fruit of our wonderful American tree, the fresh fruit of our tree, and the youth are our future. We can't let China jeopardize that. We're going to allow China to jeopardize our future. We're going to allow China to influence the minds of our youth and spread communism. And I can tell you right now that it had shit to do with China owning TikTok. The reason why you had Americans pushing for the abolition of TikTok is because the ADL for a long time had been pushing for TikTok to be banned. And you can see what the ADL had been saying. They were saying, well, TikTok is the #1 place where young people are getting their information about the Gaza war, and they're getting anti-Israel propaganda. And people on TikTok were seeing videos of dead kids. And they were sickened by it. They were sickened by the carnage. And so a lot of people started becoming anti-Israel or critical of Israel because of what they were seeing on TikTok and on X. And Israel was saying, well, we have to get rid of TikTok because it's spreading anti-Israel sentiment. But then they pushed for the abolition of TikTok under the guise of combating Chinese influence. I don't think it had anything to do with that. I think it had everything to do with trying to decrease the rising tide of anti-Israel opinion that's been growing in America. And the thing is that no matter what Israel does, the sentiment against Israel is going to continue to grow. No matter what. We've been seeing this year after year after year. The growing unpopularity for Israel. It just keeps growing every year. And these stupid Zionists who are absolutely oblivious to this reality keep shooting themselves in the foot. They keep falling into these ditches. And like blind men who fall into a ditch, they don't know how to get out. They don't know how to get out of the ditch. And they're so oblivious that they just keep digging the ditch. They just keep making the ditch deeper. Because you look at the whole Ted Cruz versus Tucker thing. I mean, what do you see? You don't see Ted Cruz having overwhelming support. You see Ted Cruz getting overwhelming humiliation, overwhelming mockery, overwhelming scoffery. And Tucker is dominating the internet. This is not a coincidence, guys. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to come to this observation.